The reading is from the life of our father among the saints, Athanasius the Confessor, Archbishop of Alexandria, celebrated on the 18th day of the month of January. Saint Athanasius the Great, that brilliant, immortal example of virtue, was born in Alexandria, the renowned capital of Egypt. His parents were devout Christians and reared him in piety. From childhood, his calling was evident, as the following story makes clear. One day, young Athanasius was playing on the shore with his friends, mimicking the rites celebrated by God's sacred ministers. The boys elected Athanasius bishop, and he named some of them presbyters and others deacons, whereupon they fetched a number of pagan children whom Athanasius baptized in the sea. Over the initiates, he pronounced the words of the Holy Mystery as he had heard the presbyter say them in church, then delivered as much of an admonition as a little boy could. At that time, our father among the saints, Alexander, was patriarch, and he happened to be standing on a bluff not far away, looking out over the water. He saw the game and was amazed. Straightway he ordered the children to be brought to him and asked them what they were doing. At first they were afraid to answer, but after some coaxing began to explain. Singling out the boys who had been baptized, the patriarch inquired what questions had been put to them and how they had replied. Having satisfied himself that everything had been done in a manner consistent with the customs of our faith, he took counsel with his clergy, decided that the baptisms were valid, and confirmed them with chrismation. He then summoned Athanasius' parents and urged them to rear him well and teach him letters. When Athanasius reached a more mature age, the patriarch said they should come back and dedicate him to the service of God and his holy church. After Athanasius completed his education, his parents did return to the most holy patriarch Alexander and dedicated him to God as the prophetess Hannah had once Samuel. The patriarch quickly admitted Athanasius to the clergy, and the young saint, like a fearless soldier, took up arms against the heretics. It is impossible to describe everything Athanasius suffered at the hands of misbelievers, but since it will not do to keep silence, we will describe some of his tribulations and more remarkable deeds. In those days, Arius, the servant of the devil, was wreaking havoc with the church. After being anathematized by the Holy Fathers of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, excommunicated and banished, it seemed the treacherous serpent was near his end, but he was in fact secretly inciting his disciples and allies to spread ruinous, insane, and poisonous doctrines everywhere, while himself awaiting an opportunity to strike again. Through his many friends at court, and especially Eusebius, bishop of Nicomedia, he petitioned the great Constantine to show clemency and permit him to return to Alexandria. The deceiver Eusebius persuaded the ruler that Arius preached nothing contrary to the teaching of the church and had been condemned by jealous bishops, not because he had erred regarding the faith, but because of a vain quarrel over words. The emperor was a trusting, guileless man and did not perceive the heretics' wiles. Believing their false assurances, he ordered everyone to stop wrangling over words, lest an unbridgeable rift develop between the churches. Out of misdirected compassion, he let Arius go back to Alexandria. This greatly grieved the Orthodox, and especially Athanasius, the steadfast champion of the traditions of piety. Christ's soldier, at that time an archdeacon, rushed to drive off the wolf, denouncing the blasphemer in eloquent sermons and divinely inspired writings. He persuaded the most holy Archbishop Alexander to write Constantine a letter, which he helped compose, pointing out the emperor's credulity in believing the heretic's lies and censuring him for permitting Arius to defy the patristic definition after he had been cast out of the church by God and the Holy Fathers for rejecting the true faith. Spurred by the miscreant Eusebius, the ruler sent a stern reply threatening to depose Alexander and defrock Athanasius if they were not silent. The good, meek, and pious emperor answered thus, not because he was wroth or inclined to Arianism, but because he loved peace with his whole heart and was zealous, though not according to knowledge, that the churches remain united. He tried to establish harmony even when this was impossible, heresy being unable to live in amity with orthodoxy. Soon the most holy Alexander reposed, and the Orthodox unanimously elected Saint Athanasius as his successor, considering him a vessel worthy to hold the myrrh of episcopal grace. For the time being, the Arians, fearful of open conflict with Athanasius, kept silent and contented themselves with secretly scattering tares. Later, however, at the instigation of the devil, they revealed their wickedness and exposed their venomous fangs. The pretext for this was the most holy Athanasius's refusal to obey an imperial order in Arius's possession. The decree commanded Athanasius to accept the transgressor into communion. Everywhere the heretics stirred up enmity against the innocent hierarch and spread vile slander. Their hope was to drive from the patriarchal throne and the city him who was worthy of the mansions of heaven. Despite the turmoil, the saint remained untroubled, chanting with David, "Though a host should array itself against me, my heart shall not be afraid." Behind the foul plot was Eusebius the ungodly, whose only claim to piety was his name. And again, his name means pious or devout. Convinced that the right moment had come to take advantage of the emperor's trusting nature, he and his allies made Athanasius's dethronement their chief goal. They were certain that if successful, they would have no difficulty in vanquishing the rest of the Orthodox and establishing Arianism in power. Eusebius began by devising vicious calumny against the saint, easily convincing the heretics of its truth. Then he bought the cooperation of Ision, a Malatinian heretic, the iniquitous Evdaemon, and the infamous Callinicus. The accusations against Athanasius were as follows. Firstly, that he compelled the Egyptians to pay a tax on priestly vestments, linen garments, altar curtains, and covers, and other ecclesiastical appointments. Secondly, that he had no respect for the emperor and disdained the imperial decrees. And thirdly, that he was avaricious and had sent a chest full of gold to one of his friends for safekeeping. To these, additional charges were added in connection with the pseudo-priest Ischerias of Meriatus. This wicked, crafty, and treacherous man, who pretended to be a presbyter without ever having been ordained, committed so many shameful and criminal acts that he was deserving not only of censure and excommunication, but of the most severe punishments meted out by the civil authorities. After being apprised of Ischyrus's deeds, the venerable Athanasius, who was extremely circumspect in such matters, sent the presbyter Macarius to Meriotis to conduct an investigation. Fearing interrogation and denunciation, the malefactor fled to Nicomedia. He found refuge with Bishop Eusebius, before whom he bitterly reviled and slandered the saint. There is nothing unusual in this. It is typical of evildoers, when cornered, to resort to the most brazen falsehoods, even when the truth is plain to see. Eusebius and his followers, for their part, joyfully welcomed the apostate and transgressor of the sacred canons as a true priest. Seeing in him a helper in their bitter struggle with Athanasius, they accorded him the highest honor. This was only natural, since like is drawn to like, the good to the good, and the wicked to the wicked. They spurred Ischyrus to vent his audacity and insolence, and promised him the rank of bishop if he would formally lodge libellous charges against the holy hierarch. The perfidious Ischyrus, being most proficient at every sort of intrigue, devised the following accusations against the blameless one. He said that at Athanasius's order, the presbyter Macarius had broken into his church like a thief, dragged him from the altar, overturned the holy table, smashed the chalice containing the divine mysteries, and set fire to the sacred books. With these allegations to add to their own, Athanasius's enemies approached Constantine. They made a special effort to arouse the sovereign's anger by stressing Athanasius's refusal to accept Arius into communion as ordered by the imperial decree. Reviewing the case, the emperor was perplexed. He was well aware of Athanasius's reputation for virtue. However, the charges as presented seemed at least somewhat credible. While refraining from condemning the saint, he ordered that an investigation be held. Since the dedication of the Church of the Resurrection was being celebrated in Jerusalem at that time, and bishops had assembled there from throughout the realm, he commanded the hierarchs at the conclusion of the festival to remove to Tyre, weigh the accusations against the great Athanasius, and review the judgment against Arius. So doing, they were to ascertain whether Arius's teachings actually violated the holy faith, and whether he was holding to the traditions of orthodoxy. If it was found that he had been excommunicated out of malice, the council was to reunite him to the church and restore his rank. If he truly taught ungodliness, he was to be condemned in accordance with the sacred canons and receive a punishment befitting his deeds. It was in the 30th year of Constantine's reign that the bishops assembled in Tyre. This was in the year 335 after the Nativity of Christ. Macarius the presbyter was presented in chains by soldiers, whose general intended to act as judge with the bishops. There were also various civil dignitaries present. When the perjured witnesses arrived, proceedings began. Athanasius was summoned and accused of taxing ecclesiastical vestments and curtains and of avarice, but the falsity of the accusations soon became evident. Then a letter from the ruler arrived, sternly denouncing the slanderers, ordering Athanasius acquitted of the unjust charges and summoning him to the imperial court. Two presbyters of the Church of Alexandria, Apis and Macarius, not the one brought to trial in bonds but another, had appeared in Nicomedia and explained to the emperor how Athanasius's enemies, seethed with hatred, had formed a conspiracy and perjured themselves. Constantine's letter inspired sufficient fear in the adherents of Eusebius that for a short time they were uncertain what to do next. Yet their fury could not be quenched by a single humiliating defeat, so they turned their rage upon the presbyter Macarius, who was still being held. Ischidas was the principal false witness, but other partisans of Eusebius, already discredited by Athanasius, presented charges as well. Athanasius demanded an investigation as to whether Ischidas was really a priest, saying that only after this would he reply to the accusations against himself. The judges would not agree and continued their trial of Macarius. After the perjurers had exhausted themselves, it was decided to stay the proceedings against Macarius, so that the site in Meriatis, where he had allegedly overturned the altar, could be examined. Seeing that injustice was prevailing, Athanasius cried out before the entire council, "Righteousness has been extinguished, truth is trampled underfoot, impartiality has perished, all pretense to lawful inquiry and a careful review of arguments has been abandoned. The accused is kept in chains while his slanderers and enemies try him. The defendant is judged by his calumniators." It was evident to the great Athanasius that his opponents were increasing in number, so after this denunciation he slipped away to the emperor. The council, or better to say the mob, condemned Athanasius for this, and as soon as the investigation in Meriatis was completed to the satisfaction of the saint's foes, the judges themselves, worthy of ousting, decreed that he be deposed. Then they repaired to Jerusalem, where they received the God-hating Arius into communion, showing that they did not truly adhere to piety and had duplicitously assented to the consubstantiality of the Father and the Son at the Council of Nicaea. Those who held to orthodoxy with their whole heart and confessed it plainly, on the other hand, perceived Arius's deception. Paying close heed to his teaching, they understood that the fox remained a sly foe of truth, and they continued to denounce him. Things were in this state when Constantine issued another decree ordering Athanasius, who had not yet arrived at court, his slanderers, and the judges to present themselves without delay. Athanasius's enemies were terrified that they would be punished for their injustice, and many slunk to their homes. Bishops Eusebius of Nicomedia and Theognisus of Nicaea, as well as several others, found plausible excuses for lingering in Tyre, which they conveyed to the emperor by letter. The remainder of Eusebius' supporters were likewise in no hurry to appear before the ruler, but Athanasius did not tarry in obeying Constantine. The Holy Hierarch regained the ruler's confidence and returned to Alexandria with a letter from him attesting that the heretic's charges were groundless. Although St. Athanasius had regained his see, Arius was still in the city, and his followers continued to stir up turmoil. Being loath to tolerate the demagogue's presence either in Alexandria or elsewhere in Egypt, the Blessed One wrote to Constantine informing him of everything and urging him to punish God's foe. Before long, a decree arrived commanding that Arius be sent in chains to stand trial at court. During the journey from Alexandria, however, Arius arranged a sojourn in Caesarea with Eusebius of Nicomedia, Theognius of Nicaea, and Marius of Chalcedon. Having no fear of God or pity for the innocent, the four villains took counsel and devised fresh slanders against Athanasius. They were obsessed with a single desire, to ensure that falsehood prevailed over truth. Of men such as these, the divine Isaiah said, "They conceive trouble and bring forth iniquity," Isaiah chapter 59. They assure one another, "We have made falsehood our hope, and by falsehood shall we be protected," Isaiah chapter 28. After completing plans for gaining the upper hand and deposing Athanasius, the heretics proceeded to court. Arius to justify himself, Eusebius and his minions to support him and bring down the Blessed One. Constantine interrogated them about the resolutions of the Council of Tyre and its condemnation of the saint. They told him, "Your Majesty, we were not so grieved by Athanasius' other transgressions as by his destruction of the altar, defiling of the chalice, and prohibition of the usual shipment of wheat from Alexandria to Constantinople. The bishops Adamantius, Anubium, Marbathium, and Peter are witnesses to his crimes. When they rebuked him for these outrages, he fled the synod, but could not escape the deposition he so richly deserved." The emperor was speechless and sorrowfully condemned the righteous one to temporary banishment in Gaul, not because he was angry or believed the calumny, but because he despaired of bringing peace to the church by any other means, as eyewitnesses reported. Constantine realized that the larger portion of the episcopacy had risen up against Athanasius, and that the unrest in Alexandria and Egypt had become quite serious. Desiring to still the tempest and pacify the bishops, he thought it best to remove the saint from the city for a time. At the end of the 30th year of his reign, Constantine died, having reached the age of 65. On his deathbed, he left the empire to his sons Constantine, Constantius, and Constans. According to his will, Constantine, the eldest, was to receive the largest portion. None of the sons, however, was present as he lay dying, so the ruler entrusted his will to a presbyter who was a secret follower of Arius. The priest hid the will, and when questioned as to whether the emperor had left a last testament, remained silent. Several of Constantine's eunuchs knew of its existence and conspired with the priest to keep it secret. Constantine, the eldest son, did not arrive to pay his last respects for quite some time, but Constantius came in a hurry from Antioch. The presbyter handed over the will to Constantius, asking only that he foster Arianism in every way possible. Oh, what folly! The false priest urges the ungrateful ruler not to thank Christ, the immortal King, for the throne, but to deny the divinity of the Master of all. Meanwhile, Eusebius and his allies, hoping that victory was near and determined to gain a free hand in spreading Arius' teachings, shamelessly intrigued to have the new emperor confirm Athanasius' exile as a just and necessary measure. They won over the chief eunuch of the palace, who in turn spread the plague of Arianism among the other eunuchs, who were by nature easily inclined to every wickedness and eager to disseminate evil. Little by little, they also corrupted the empress. Before long, the emperor, completely led astray by the Arians' arguments, openly rose up against Christ the Lord and Master, and the words written in the book of the divine Jeremiah were fulfilled. "The shepherds also transgressed against me," Jeremiah chapter 2. Constantius publicly sanctioned Arianism, ordered all bishops to believe as he did, and threatened the insubordinate with dire penalties. In this violent storm, the true helmsmen of the churches were Maximus of Jerusalem, Alexander of Constantinople, and Athanasius of Alexandria, who, though in exile, continued to guide the ark of salvation and uphold orthodoxy by his discourses and epistles. It was at this juncture that Arius met his inglorious end, death overtaking him in the following manner. The arch-deceiver Eusebius, with the cooperation of the civil authorities, introduced Arius into the churches of Constantinople with much fanfare, scandalizing and dismaying the faithful, who without Athanasius were leaderless. Here's a footnote. Saint Alexander of Constantinople was almost 100 years old at the time. While age precluded his struggling with Arianism as vigorously as did Saint Athanasius, he performed a great service for the church in this crisis. It was his holy prayers that brought about Arius' death. Nevertheless, all-wise Providence did not forsake the Orthodox, but set the miscreants' plans at naught and put an end to Arius' evil-doing and life. Divine justice overtook the herald of godlessness and shattered the vessel of iniquity, reeking with the filth of heresy. While Arius was using a public latrine, his belly split open, and he spilled out his bowels no less violently than his mouth spewed out blasphemy. Lying in a pool of his own blood and entrails, the wretch vomited his soul. The leadership in disseminating heresy then fell to Eusebius and his shameless lackeys, who, after disposing of Arius's carcass, declared outright war on the Orthodox and fiercely oppressed the Church of Christ. With the eunuchs in their hands, they stirred up confusion everywhere. Their chief concern was to silence Athanasius, preventing him from circulating from exile his writings in defense of the faith. This was no easy task, because God, the overseer of all creation, was guiding the heart of Constantine, eldest son of Constantine the Great. Despite Constantius's maneuvers, Constantine remained senior emperor and ruled Old Rome. Here's a footnote. Actually, Constans controlled Rome, but he was apparently under the supervision of his eldest brother. That's a translator's note. He repealed St. Athanasius' sentence of banishment and restored him to his see. With the Blessed One, he sent this letter. He said, "The Emperor Constantine to the Catholic Church of Alexandria and its faithful greetings. You are doubtless aware of the recent tribulations of Athanasius, the great preacher of piety and teacher of God's law. So that he might have a respite from the ceaseless attacks of the enemies of truth, he was sent to me in Gaul, but was not condemned to perpetual banishment. We have shown him every courtesy, and seen to it that he enjoy rest from tribulations, although being aflame with zeal for God, he excels all in patience, and can easily bear any burden. Our father, the blessed Constantine, had every intention of restoring him to the patriarchal throne, but was unable to carry out his plan before his repose. On his deathbed, he left the matter to me, his heir. Therefore, I command you to receive this holy man with every honor and welcome him solemnly." St. Athanasius arrived in Alexandria with the letter from the emperor and was greeted joyously by the Orthodox. The ungodly Arians, however, stirred up turmoil against the holy hierarch. They accused him of seizing the patriarchal throne without proper election and of cutting off the hand of a clergyman named Arsenius. The hand, said the minions of Eusebius, who were themselves well-known practitioners of the black art, was employed by Athanasius to work sorcerous miracles. They reported this to Constantius and begged him to banish the Blessed One permanently, but the ruler would not agree to this without an inquest. He sent Arcadius, one of his household officials, and Nonus, a state treasurer, to Tyre, where Athanasius had gone to await investigation. Upon arrival, they decided to postpone the inquiry until the slanderers who maintained that they had seen the severing of Arsenius' hand and Athanasius' sorcery could be brought from Alexandria. The delay took place in accordance with providence, as the end of the affair showed, for God, looking down from on high, intended to deliver the oppressed from his persecutors, utilizing Arsenius himself as his agent. Arsenius was a lector of the Church of Alexandria, had committed a grievous transgression, and had been condemned to severe punishment. Fearing this, he hid for a lengthy period of time. No one knew where. Athanasius's villainous opponents, for all their experience in crime, never supposed that Arsenius would reappear, so shameful was his sin and stern the judgment he had incurred. They noised abroad by letter and word of mouth the fact that Athanasius was under investigation for using the hand of Arsenius' corpse for magical purposes, and at length Arsenius, still in his hideaway, learned of this. Remembering the many kindnesses shown to him by his spiritual father, St. Athanasius, he was moved to pity and grieved that the fabrication might prove successful. He emerged from hiding, went to Tyre, and fell at Athanasius' holy feet. The Blessed One rejoiced to see him and told him not to reveal himself to anyone before the trial. Meanwhile, Athanasius' malicious adversaries, not satisfied with the accusations they had thus far devised, added to them a fresh lie. The wretched heretics hired a shameless woman to say that Athanasius, while visiting in her home, had forced himself upon her. At the beginning of the trial, the judges took their seats, and the slanderers were brought in, the woman with them, weeping theatrically. She vilified Athanasius, though she had never laid eyes on him and did not even know what he looked like. "I invited him to my home as a holy and respected man," she said, "hoping to be edified by him and obtain a blessing for myself and my house. Never did I expect that he would assault me. It was midnight when he crawled into my bed. He chose his moment well, for everyone was fast asleep and there was no escape from his clutches." While the hussy was perjuring herself and flooding the chambers with false tears, the presbyter Timothy was standing outside with Athanasius and listening to the calumny. Suddenly, overcome by exasperation, he rushed into the court and demanded of the slanderess, as though he were Athanasius, "Was it I who raped you, woman? Was it I? This man ruined me." She unashamedly cried to the judges, "This man robbed my purity, repaying me for hospitality by ill use." Even some of the judges had a good laugh at this. The ringleaders were put to shame because their deceit was clearly exposed, and everyone marveled at the ineptitude of the fabrication. Then Athanasius's enemies accused him of sorcery and Arsenius's murder. They displayed a horrible decayed hand, which they insolently brandished at the saint while shouting, "This hand protests against you, Athanasius. This hand denounces you. You cannot escape its testimony, either by cunning arguments or trickery. Everyone knows it is the hand of Arsenius, and that you mercilessly severed it. Admit why you did so and how you used it." Athanasius listened patiently, at first imitating Christ the Lord, who, while being condemned by the Jews, neither contradicted them nor cried out, but remained silent, like a lamb taken to slaughter. Finally he asked in a meek voice, "Do any of you know Arsenius well? Can any identify this hand as his beyond a doubt?" When many rose, maintaining that they were well acquainted with Arsenius, and that the hand was certainly his, Athanasius drew back the curtain behind which Arsenius was, standing and holding him to step forward. Told him to step forward, Glaring at his accusers, the Blessed One thundered, "Is this not Arsenius, whose hand you say was cut off? Is this not the Arsenius known to all of Alexandria?" So saying, he ordered Arsenius to dispel first his right hand, then his left. "Here is Arsenius," the saint proclaimed. "Here are his hands, which most certainly have not been severed. Show us your Arsenius, if there is another, or tell us whose is the rotting hand that condemns you as criminals." Utterly humiliated, the Blessed One's accusers hid their faces and abandoned the tribunal in shame, as did the bishops and judges. Athanasius remained alone with the guards, whereupon the rabble thronged him and reviled him as a liar and sorcerer. The mob assaulted and would have killed him had not Archelaus, the emperor's official, snatched him away. Archelaus was a kind man and convinced of Athanasius's innocence. Seeing how numerous were the saints' enemies and that their hatred was unquenchable, he advised Athanasius to hide. The blessed hierarch agreed, and with Archelaus's help slipped out of the city. The next day the unjust judges, without Archelaus, assembled and condemned Athanasius as a rapist, murderer, and warlock. Their conclusions were published everywhere, and access to cities and churches throughout the realm was denied the saint. The Emperor Constantius was so enraged by the Blessed One's escape that he promised estates and honors to anyone who revealed Athanasius's whereabouts or brought him the fugitive's head. For quite some time Athanasius, fleeing not only the imperial authority but all men, hid in the dry shaft of a deep, abandoned well. No one knew he was there except the pious man who fed him. Eventually his presence was suspected by the heretics, who began searching the area and inquiring after him. They made plans one evening to probe into the well, and next morning, but the saint, forewarned by Providence, removed to another place. He did not remain there long enough, however. Fearing discovery, he sought refuge in the Western Empire. At that time the West was ruled by Constans. Constantine, his eldest brother, had been killed in battle at Aquileia on the river Ans. Arriving in Europe, the blessed Athanasius presented himself to Julius, Pope of Rome, and to Constans, to whom he related his story in detail. Meanwhile, a group of Eastern bishops had assembled at Antioch to consecrate a church begun by Constantine the Great and completed by Constantius. Among them, there were many Arians who, with Constantius' approval, gathered in council and declared St. Athanasius deposed. They wrote a slanderous letter against the Lord's favorite to Pope Julius, urging him to recognize the deposition, and appointed Eusebius of Emesa, renowned for his eloquence, to the throne of Alexandria, but he declined to accept, knowing the love of the faithful for their pastor Athanasius. Then the Arians consecrated an outright heretic, Gregory of Cappadocia, as archbishop, but he failed to reach the city before Athanasius returned there from Rome. Pope Julius, after carefully reviewing the accusations, declared them false and sent Athanasius back to Alexandria with a letter sternly threatening those who had risen up against him. The Orthodox citizens welcomed the saint, but his opponents, now without the leadership of Eusebius of Nicomedia, who had died, were greatly dismayed. They prevailed upon Constantius to send an army to install Gregory as bishop, and soon the heretic elected by heretics arrived with troops commanded by a general named Syrianus. The general had orders to kill Athanasius and secure the cathedral for Gregory. On the eve of a certain feast, when all the Orthodox were assembled in Alexandria's cathedral with their pastor Athanasius celebrating the all-night vigil, Syrianus and his soldiers burst in with swords drawn. They did no harm to the worshippers, but searched the building for Athanasius, whom they intended to murder. Again God protected the saint, who escaped death like a fish slipping out of a net. Amid the general confusion and the clamor of the crowd, he left the building, surrounded by a group of the faithful, and took ship for Rome. The impious Gregory mounted Athanasius' throne, but the people remained in an uproar, so much so that rioters burned down the church of Saint Dionysius. The holy Athanasius remained in Rome for 3 years. He enjoyed the profound respect of the Emperor Constans and Pope Julius, and while there became the friend of St. Paul, Archbishop of Constantinople, who had also been driven from his throne by heretics. Finally, Constantius and Constans agreed to hold a council at Sardica. Both Eastern and Western bishops would deliberate matters of faith in the cases of Athanasius and Paul. As it turned out, more than 300 bishops from the West attended, but less than 70 from the East. Among the latter was the aforementioned pseudo-priest Ischyrus, now elevated by the Arians to the rank of Bishop of Mariatus. The Eastern hierarchs refused to have anything to do with the Westerners unless Paul and Athanasius were expelled from the synod, but the Western bishops would not hear of this. As a result, the Easterners quit the assembly. When they reached the Thracian city of Philippopolis, they organized their own council, or better to say, a conclave of iniquity. There they solemnly anathematized the doctrine of the consubstantiality of the Father and the Son. Oh, how great is thy long-suffering, Christ our King! Without delay, the heretics sent out notices of their decisions to all the churches in their power. Learning of this, the Holy Fathers assembled at Sardica pronounced the anathema against the assembly of blaspheming miscreants and its impious confession of faith. Athanasius' slanderers were deposed, the symbol of the holy faith drawn up at Nicaea was confirmed, and the consubstantiality of God the Son and God the Father stated in the clearest terms possible. After this, Constans sent a letter to Constantius requesting that Paul and Athanasius be permitted to return to their sees. When his brother declined, Constans dispatched a second sterner letter, writing, "If you do not heed me, I will attack you with all my forces, and myself set the bishops on their thrones." Constantius panicked and received Paul, who went back to the east first, allowing him to resume his archiepiscopal duties. Afterwards, the Eastern emperor sent a letter of apology to Athanasius in Rome, begging him to appear at court. The saint accepted the invitation, giving Constantius the opportunity to speak with him at length. Constantius showed Athanasius every courtesy and admitted that he was a wise and spiritual man. He issued orders restoring him to his see and wrote to the people of Alexandria, to the bishops and nobles of Egypt, to the Augustalius Nestorius, and to all the imperial officials in the Thebed and Libya, ordering them to greet Athanasius with honor and reverence. Moreover, when the Lord's favorite set out for Egypt, he personally escorted him for a considerable distance. With the imperial missives in hand, the Blessed One journeyed through Syria and Palestine and visited the holy city of Jerusalem, where he was lovingly welcomed by Christ's confessor, Patriarch Maximus. The hierarchs recounted to one another their tribulations, and the most holy Maximus summoned the Eastern bishops who, out of fear of the Arians, had consented to Athanasius' deposition. Athanasius entered into communion with them. They accorded him due honor, and he forgave their offense. The saint reached Alexandria and was welcomed by the populace, bishops, and nobles with a great celebration. This was his third return to his see after exile. It was Athanasius' hope that after so many difficulties and sufferings, he would have some rest and spend the remainder of his life in peace. But even then, a storm of troubles was gathering. The impious Magnentius, a general in the Roman army, formed a conspiracy and murdered his master, the devout Emperor Constans. With this, the Arians lifted up the horn and resumed their persecution of the Church of Christ. Fresh attacks were made on Athanasius. His tribulations began anew. Imperial decrees were issued against him, and he took flight. Constantius's men searched land and sea to find the Holy Hierarch, but without success. Gregory of Cappadocia, whom the Arians had consecrated and employed to dispossess Athanasius of his throne, returned to Alexandria, throwing Egypt, Palestine, and the entire East into turmoil. The universal luminaries, Saint Maximus of Jerusalem and Paul of Constantinople, were expelled from their sees. Regarding events in Alexandria, the great Athanasius wrote the following: "Troops with orders to murder me arrived during Holy Lent, and disorders worse than the previous ones ensued. Soldiers surrounded the cathedral. Prayer gave way to tumult, and screams and cries rent the air. Gregory the Cappadocian, that creature of the Macedonians and Arians, did everything he could to foster violence, being an apt student of his masters. After the week of Pascha, the soldiers began clapping virgins and bishops in irons, occupying the homes of orphans and widows, and pillaging the city. Christians sealed their houses and escaped Alexandria under cover of darkness, leaving the clergy to lament their departure. The tyranny was extreme, but worse was to follow. After Pentecost, the people, spurning Gregory and communion with him, fasted and assembled at the tomb of the holy hieromartyr Peter. When the impostor learned this, he sent Sebastian, a general who adhered to the Manichaean heresy, and a large company of soldiers to the church. With swords bared and bows strung, they forced their way in. Most of the faithful had left, since it was very late, but such as remained, the general subjected to extreme cruelties. He ordered an enormous fire, stood the virgins near the flames, and demanded that they accept Arianism. Since the maidens were unintimidated either by threats or fire, and their faithfulness to orthodoxy was unshakable, he stripped them and commanded they be flogged mercilessly. Their faces were so covered with welts that even their parents could scarcely recognize them for quite some time. Those selected for the worst mistreatment were exiled to the great oasis. A novel torment was devised for the men, who numbered 40. They were lashed with the fronds of date palms. Thorns broke off in their flayed shoulders, so that many required surgery. Some died in unspeakable agony. Sebastian would not permit the families of the slain Orthodox Christians to remove the bodies, but had his crazed, murderous soldiers hide them unburied. In this way, he thought he would prevent their cruelty from becoming known. The Orthodox rejoiced at the steadfast confession of the martyrs, but lamented the theft of their remains, on account of which they bitterly reviled the inhuman persecutors. After this, the following bishops were expelled from Egypt: Ammonius, Thymius, Caius, Philo, Hermes, Pliny, Lysanosius, Dilaman, Agatho, Anagaphus, Mark, another Ammonius, another Mark, Dracontius, Adelphius, and Athenodorus. The presbyters, hierarchs, and Discoros were also deported. So harshly were they misused that some died on the way, others at their place of banishment. By the end of the rampage, the Arians had exiled 30 bishops. Their malice was like Ahab's, so vicious they would have wiped the truth from the face of the earth were it possible. That's the end of St. Athanasius' remarks. Meanwhile, the Emperor Constantius had vanquished Magentius, Constan's murderer, and became ruler of the East and West. He now undertook to spread the Arian heresy in both halves of the realm, alluring the Western bishops to adopt it and threatening punishment if they did not. Some of the hierarchs accepted Arianism out of fear, others because of the prospect of favor and advancement. With the objective of deposing Athanasius again, Constantius ordered that a synod be convened in the Italian city of Mediolanum, and now this is Milan, translator note, since he was certain Arianism could prevail only if the saint was completely discredited and blotted out from among the living. The bishops, firmly devoted to piety, denounced the lawless assembly. Among these were Eusebius of Vercellae, Dionysius of Mediolanum, Rhodanus of Tolosa, Paulinus of Treverorum, and Lucifer of Carolus, all of whom considered that to sign a decree deposing Athanasius constituted a denial of the true faith. As a result, they were exiled to Arminium. Fearing that they would be outnumbered by Orthodox hierarchs, the 30 Arian bishops assembled at Mediolanum were in a great hurry to depose Athanasius and complete their work. They cowed Dionysius, the young, newly consecrated Orthodox bishop of the city, into signing their decree. He submitted only because he was intimidated by so many elderly, well-known prelates. Afterwards, Eusebius, Orthodox bishop of Versailles, arrived in Mediolanum and asked Dionysius what was happening at the council. Deeply regretting his transgression, Dionysius explained that an unjust sentence had been pronounced against Saint Athanasius, and that he had been pressured into assenting to it. For this the blessed Eusebius upbraided him as a father might a son, since he was older than Dionysius, had been a bishop much longer, was Dionysius' spiritual father, and Versailles as a see had precedence over Mediolanum. Perceiving Dionysius' heartfelt repentance, Eusebius told him not to grieve. "We will simply remove your name from the document," he said. The Arian bishops learned about Eusebius' coming and invited him to the council. Showing him the decree of deposing Athanasius, they begged him to add his signature to theirs. Eusebius pretended to agree and read the names of the prelates who had signed. Reaching Dionysius' signature, he exclaimed indignantly, "Where am I to sign? Under Dionysius? Never. Dionysius cannot have precedence over me. You say that the Son of God cannot be equal to God the Father. How can you prefer my Son to me? I will not sign unless Dionysius' name is erased and I am given its spot." The Arian bishops, intent on obtaining his signature, consented to the demand, and Dionysius himself removed every trace of his name. Delighted to have duped the heretics, Eusebius then announced, "I will never approve your blasphemies or allow my son Dionysius to do so. It is unlawful to depose an innocent bishop, a violation of the law of God and the canons of the Church. Eusebius and Dionysius refused to sign your malicious, wicked condemnation. I thank God for suggesting to me how to efface my son's signature and disassociate him from your crimes." At this, the Arians flew into a rage and attacked Eusebius and Dionysius. After subjecting them to much violence, they exiled them each to a separate place. The blessed Eusebius was so badly abused in banishment that he died a martyr. Word of this reached Athanasius, who also learned by a divine vision that the eparch's soldiers at the emperor's command were coming to arrest him. He slipped away in the middle of the night and took refuge in the home of a true handmaiden of God, a saintly consecrated virgin. Absolutely no one knew his whereabouts save God and that virgin who served him and supplied him with borrowed books. While living with her, the saint wrote many treatises against the heretics. He did not leave hiding until after the death of the Emperor Constantius. Meanwhile, the faithful were searching frantically for their pastor, whose disappearance had resulted in general lamentation. Without exception, the Christians avowed that they were willing to sacrifice their lives if so doing they could return the saint to Alexandria. The Holy Church mourned, and the Arian heresy gained strength not only in the east but in the west. Throughout Italy and the western lands, the emperor deposed bishops who insisted that the Son is consubstantial with the Father. Liberius, Pope of Rome and successor to the blessed Julius and Saint Sylvester, was deprived of his see because he remained steadfast. His throne was given to the heretic Felix. Finally, after the Arians had persecuted the Holy Church for a considerable time, the Emperor Constantius died. He yielded up the ghost at Mopsucrine while traveling through Cilicia toward Cappadocia. At about the same time, divine retribution overtook Gregory, the pseudo-bishop consecrated by heretics and usurper of Saint Athanasius' throne. He perished ingloriously, being slain by Greeks of Alexandria, whose property he had attempted to confiscate. Constantius was succeeded by Julian, who revoked everything enacted by his predecessor and recalled the confessors from exile. At the beginning of his reign, Julian had not yet revealed his complete apostasy, and Athanasius feared that the Arians would infect him with their heresy. Nevertheless, in the dead of night, the saint left the Virgin's house and appeared in the cathedral of Alexandria. Who can describe the joy of the Orthodox as they rushed to see him? Who can express the delight of clergy and laity as they gazed upon him and lovingly embraced him? With Athanasius' return, the Orthodox took courage and drove the Arians out of the city, which they then entrusted to the care of their shepherd and teacher. As soon as the iniquitous Julian, who was already a secret pagan, had consolidated his hold on the throne, he renounced Christ openly and reviled his holy name. The wretched ostentatiously worshipped idols, opened heathen temples, commanded that abominable sacrifices be offered to the vile gods, erected altars everywhere, fouled the air with smoke and stench, made a great slaughter of animals, and poured out their blood in torrents. This called forth denunciations on the part of the great pillars and teachers of the church, to which Julian responded by initiating a persecution of the believers. The ruler took counsel with his aides and the most eminent sorcerers as to how he might extirpate the Christian faith, and they advised him that the first step must be to murder Athanasius. Their reasoning was that if the foundation could be destroyed, the edifice of faith would collapse as a matter of course. Julian agreed. Again preparations were made for a lawless trial to condemn the saint. Again the city was thrown into turmoil. Again the cathedral was surrounded by soldiers with instructions to slay Athanasius. Protected by God, the holy hierarch passed through the crowd and out of the building, escaping in the night to the bank of the Nile. As the saint was about to board a boat and make for the Tibet, his admirers caught up with him and with tears in their eyes entreated him to remain. "Are you abandoning us again, Father?" they asked. "Will you leave us like sheep without a shepherd? Who will take your place?" "Do not weep, children," replied the saint. "The present disturbance will soon come to an end." With this he sailed away. An officer and a company of barbarian soldiers in a swift vessel followed in hot pursuit with orders to slay the saint, and it was not long before they were closing. Athanasius urged the crew to row faster, but a moment later he received a divine revelation and ordered the boat to turn towards Alexandria. The oarsmen were confused and fearful, but the Blessed One told them to take heart. They reversed course, and when close to the pursuers, the saint shouted, "Who are you chasing?" The barbarians' eyes were clouded so that they could not recognize him, and they answered, "Athanasius, have you seen him?" The holy bishop said, "He is trying to outrun you. Hurry, and you will catch him." The soldiers continued southward, and as soon as they were out of sight, Athanasius' vessel made for Alexandria at full speed. Disembarking, the saint was greeted joyfully by the faithful. Notwithstanding, he went into hiding until Julian's death. After the foe of God perished, Jovian, a devout Christian, ascended the throne, and Saint Athanasius was able to resume his duties, guiding the church wisely. Jovian did not reign for long, only 7 months, but died unexpectedly in Galatia. He was succeeded by Valens, who was infected with the plague of Arianism. Again tribulations rocked the church, since the godless emperor did not concern himself with diplomacy or strengthening the army or conquering barbarians, but only with the spread of error. Orthodox bishops were expelled from their sees if they would not embrace heresy. First to be driven out was Saint Meletius, Archbishop of Antioch. Soon orders reached the prefect of Alexandria requiring that he initiate persecution of the church. The eparch's troops searched the city for the great sufferer Athanasius, but he slipped away and hid in his family's crypt. For about 4 months, no one knew where he was. Finally, the great metropolis, grieving because of the saint's absence and offended by Valens' tyranny, rose in rebellion. Fearing the outcome of civil war, the emperor reluctantly allowed Athanasius to return to his see. Christ's aged soldier, veteran of so many battles for orthodoxy, who had been exiled and forced to flee repeatedly, enjoyed a short period of peace before he was gathered to his fathers, the patriarchs, prophets, apostles, martyrs, and confessors, whose contest he emulated during his lifetime. Saint Athanasius was a bishop for 46 years and was succeeded by his blessed friend and companion in sufferings, Peter. Taking up his dwelling in heaven, he was crowned with a garland of light and rewarded with ineffable blessings by Christ the Lord, unto whom, with the Father and the Holy Spirit, be glory, dominion, honor, and worship, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Through the prayers of our Holy Father among the saints, Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen.